The graduation cap felt heavier in Torres Castillo's weathered hands than it had any right to. He stood outside the university auditorium at 7:45 a.m., 3 hours before the ceremony, because he'd driven through the night from the construction site in Phoenix. His beat-up Ford pickup looked out of place among the sleek sedans and SUVs in the parking lot, but Torres didn't care. This was his daughter's day, the day 22 years of sacrifice would finally pay off. His phone buzzed. A text from Evelyn. "Dad, I know you're probably here, but I need you to understand this day is about me and my future. Please don't make this complicated. I'll call you later." Torres read the message 3 times, each word cutting deeper than the last. His thumb hovered over the keypad, a dozen responses forming and dissolving in his mind. Make this complicated? What was complicated about a father wanting to watch his daughter graduate summa cum laude from one of the most prestigious business schools in the country? He looked down at his hands, scarred from years of construction work, permanently stained despite scrubbing them raw that morning. The same hands that had changed her diapers, braided her hair for school pictures, and worked 18-hour days to keep food on the table after her mother died when Evelyn was 12. The memory hit him like a physical blow. 10-year-old Evelyn standing on a milk crate in their tiny kitchen, her small hands guiding his as they practiced writing checks together. "When I'm rich, Papi," she'd said in her mixture of English and Spanish, "I'll buy you a big house with a pool." He'd laughed and kissed the top of her head, never imagining that someday she'd be too embarrassed to let him see the success they'd built together. Doris walked to his truck and sat behind the wheel, watching families stream into the auditorium. A man in an expensive suit adjusted his tie while his wife dabbed concealer under her eyes, preparing for tears of joy. A grandmother clutched a bouquet of roses, her face radiant with pride. Through the glass doors, he could see the auditorium filling with people who belonged, people whose presence wouldn't complicate their children's achievements. His phone rang. For a moment, hope fluttered in his chest, but the caller ID read Javier Torres, his younger brother. "Hermano, how's our college graduate?" Javier's voice was warm with excitement. She doesn't want me at the ceremony." The silence on the other end stretched like a wound. "What do you mean she doesn't want you there?" Torres explained the text, his voice growing quieter with each word. Javier listened without interruption, but Torres could hear his brother's anger building in the spaces between his words. "After everything you'd done for that girl? After you sold Mom's wedding ring to pay for her first semester? After you worked 3 jobs so she could go to that fancy prep school? After you—" "Javi, stop." Torres closed his eyes. "She's not a girl anymore. She's a woman, and she gets to make her own choices. Even when those choices break your heart." Torres watched a family pose for photos near the auditorium entrance, 3 generations celebrating together. Especially then. The ceremony began at 10 a.m. Torres sat in his truck until 2 p.m., listening to graduation speeches filter through the open windows of the building. He heard the dean mention academic excellence, the valedictorian speak about perseverance, and finally the roll call of graduating students. When they called Evelyn Mark, his heart swelled with pride, even as it shattered with loss. She dropped his name somewhere along the way to success. 3 weeks later, Torres was replacing shingles on Mrs. Rodriguez's roof when his phone rang. The August heat was brutal, and sweat dripped steadily onto the old woman's garden below. He almost didn't answer. He'd been avoiding calls from friends asking about the graduation, making excuses about being busy with work. "Dad?" Evelyn's voice sounded different, smaller, younger. Doris set down his hammer and moved to the shade of the chimney. "Mija, I got fired." The words hung in the desert air between them. Torres had to force himself not to immediately offer comfort, not to fall back into the pattern of being her solution to every problem. "What happened?" I don't know. I mean, I do know, but I don't understand how it happened so fast. Her voice cracked. The job I was so sure about, the one I moved to New York for, the one I burned bridges for, they said I wasn't a cultural fit. Torres knew that phrase. He'd heard it enough times when he'd tried to expand his contracting business into upscale neighborhoods. I'm sorry to hear that. That's it? That's all you're going to say? The desperation in her voice reminded him of the little girl who used to crawl into his lap after nightmares about her mother. What do you want me to say, Evelyn? I don't know. Something. Anything. You always knew what to say before. You always had a plan, a way to fix things. You'd make that face, you know the one, where your eyebrows come together and you get really quiet, and then you'd have this solution that I never would have thought of. Torres knew that face. He'd made it when the bank threatened foreclosure on their house. He'd made it when Evelyn's high school guidance counselor said she'd never get into a top-tier college with their financial situation. He'd made it the night before every major decision that had shaped their lives. Before what? He asked quietly. Before I became such a disappointment. The words hit him like a 2x4 to the chest. Torres had to grip the edge of the roof to steady himself. Mija, you have never, not once, been a disappointment to me. He heard her breath catch, and suddenly he was transported back to the hospital room where she was born, the doctor placing this tiny, perfect person in his arms while his wife smiled weakly from the bed. She's going to change the world, Elena had whispered. 3 months later, Elena was gone, and Torres was left to raise this world changer alone. Then why didn't you fight to be at my graduation? Evelyn's voice was barely a whisper now. Why didn't you push back when I told you not to come? The Torres Castillo I grew up with would have shown up anyway. He would have found a way to be there without making me feel bad about it. Torres closed his eyes, remembering the countless times he'd swallowed his pride for her sake. The parent-teacher conferences where other fathers talked about their golf games, while he sat quietly, hoping his work clothes didn't smell too strongly of sawdust. The college campus visits where he'd stayed in the background, pretending not to notice how Evelyn introduced him as my dad without any of the elaboration other kids gave. No mention of his business, his accomplishments, his dreams. Because, he said finally, I thought that's what you wanted. I thought I was finally giving you what you'd been asking for all these years. What do you mean? I looked out over the neighborhood I'd helped build, at the houses where families were probably sitting down to dinner right now. Do you remember when you were 16 and I came to pick you up from Sarah Chen's house? Silence. You were so angry that I hadn't changed out of my work clothes first. You said I embarrassed you in front of her parents, who were both doctors. You said you wished I could be more like other dads, the ones who wore ties to work and didn't have dirt under their fingernails. Dad, I was 16 and stupid, and you were honest. And I learned to read the signs after that. The way you'd tense up when my accent got thicker around your college friends. How you'd change the subject when they asked what I did for work. The relief in your voice when you got that scholarship so I didn't have to come to the financial aid meetings anymore. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared in her garden below, watering her tomatoes and humming an old Spanish song. She looked up and waved, and Torres waved back, remembering all the times Evelyn had been embarrassed by my easy intimacy with our neighbors, my willingness to help with anything from fixing leaky faucets to translating documents at the immigration office. I thought, Torres continued, staying away from your graduation was the gift you'd been waiting for, a father who finally understood his place in your new world. The silence that followed was different, heavier, loaded with years of misunderstanding finally finding their way to the surface. Oh, God, Dad, that's not... I never meant... I know, Mija. I know you didn't mean to hurt me, but intentions and impact aren't always the same thing. I need to see you. You're in New York,
I'm in Phoenix. Then I'm coming home. Torres felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the knot he'd carried since graduation day. This will always be your home, Evelyn, but you need to decide if this is where you want to be, or if you're just running away from something else. After he hung up, Torres sat on Mrs. Rodriguez's roof until the sunset, thinking about the weight of love and the price of dreams. Tomorrow, he'd finish the shingles and start on the Garcia family's fence. Next week, he'd begin framing the new community center. The work would continue, just as it always had. But something fundamental had shifted. For the first time since graduation day, Torres allowed himself to hope.
2 days later, Evelyn stood on her father's doorstep at 6 a.m., her MBA diploma tucked under her arm and 2 suitcases at her feet. She'd taken a red-eye flight from JFK, spending the entire 6 hours staring out the window and rehearsing conversations that now seemed inadequate in the face of actually being here. The house looked smaller than she remembered, but somehow more solid. The desert landscaping Torres had installed himself was thriving despite the August heat. A new coat of paint made the stucco walls look fresh and welcoming. This was the house where she'd grown up, where every inch held memories of the life they'd built together after her mother died. Torres opened the door wearing the same type of work clothes she'd once been embarrassed by, sturdy jeans and a faded blue shirt that had probably cost $12 at Walmart. But now she saw them differently. These weren't the clothes of a man who didn't know better. They were the uniform of someone who worked with his hands to build things that mattered. "I brought you something," she whispered, holding out the diploma. Torres looked at the expensive frame, at the name Evelyn Mark. She watched his eyes trace over the gold lettering, the university seal, the Latin phrases that meant nothing compared to the 22 years of sacrifice they represented. "This belongs to you more than me," she continued, her voice breaking. "Every late night you worked overtime to pay for my books. Every time you chose the generic cereal so I could have name-brand shoes. Every English lesson you gave me even though you were exhausted from working since 5 a.m. Every dream you put on hold so I could chase mine." Torres took the diploma with trembling hands, but his eyes never left his daughter's face. "You kept my name off this on purpose?" Evelyn's carefully rehearsed explanations crumbled. The sob that escaped came from somewhere deep and painful, a place she'd been avoiding for years. "I was ashamed. God, Dad, I was ashamed of where I came from, and I thought if I could just get far enough away, successful enough, different enough, then maybe I could forget that I used to be embarrassed when you showed up to school events with paint under my fingernails." She sank onto the porch steps, unable to look at him. "I thought success meant leaving everything behind, including the person who made it all possible. When my new colleagues talked about their families, I'd make you sound smaller, less important. I'd say you worked construction instead of owned a construction company. I'd change the subject when they asked about my childhood." Torres set the diploma aside and sat beside her on the steps, the same steps where he taught her to tie her shoes, where they watched thunderstorms roll across the desert, where he held her the night before she left for college. "Tell me about the job," he said quietly. Evelyn wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture that reminded Torres of the 5-year-old who used to help him in the garage by asking endless questions about how things worked. "I thought I was everything they wanted. Harvard MBA, internships at top firms, perfect grades. But I didn't fit. I was too earnest, I guess, too hungry. The other associates had this casual confidence, like success was their birthright. They'd make these references I didn't understand. Summer houses in the Hamptons, ski trips to Aspen.
prep schools I'd never heard of. She turned to face him for the first time since arriving. I realized I'd spent so much energy running away from who I was that I never learned how to be who I wanted to become. I threw away my roots, but never grew new ones. Torres reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the same gesture he'd made 1,000 times when she was small. Mija, you were never supposed to carry my dreams. You were supposed to build your own. But your dreams were beautiful, she whispered. Remember when we used to drive around on Sundays and you'd point out all the houses you'd worked on? You knew every family, every story. The Martinez's kitchen renovation after their son was born, the Johnsons' wheelchair ramp after the accident, the community center where kids go after school, so they're safe until their parents get home from work. Torres nodded, remembering those drives. They'd been his way of showing Evelyn that their life had meaning, that his work mattered even if it didn't come with a corner office and a 6-figure salary. You weren't just building structures, Dad. You were building community. You were building hope. And I threw that away because I was too proud to see that what we had was already valuable. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun climbed higher over the desert. A mockingbird landed in the Palo Verde tree Torres had planted the year Evelyn started high school, singing its complex song of borrowed melodies. "What now?" Torres asked, finally. Evelyn looked at her father, really looked at him. She saw the lines around his eyes that came from squinting in the desert sun, the calluses on his hands that spoke of decades of honest work, the quiet strength that had held their family together when everything else fell apart. "I want to learn," she said. "I want to understand what I walked away from. I want to know how to run a business that matters, how to be successful without losing my soul. I want to remember where I came from." Torres smiled for the first time since graduation day. "Home isn't a place you come back to, Mija. It's something you carry with you. You never lost it. You just forgot how to access it." "Will you teach me?" "Teach you what?" "Everything. How the business really works, how to read blueprints and manage crews and bid on jobs, how to balance the books and handle permits and deal with difficult clients, how to build something that lasts." Torres considered this, thinking about the expansion plans he'd been developing, the contracts he'd been afraid to pursue without someone who understood the business side of construction. "I've been thinking about bringing in a partner," he said carefully. "Someone with business sense, someone who knows about marketing and management and all those things they taught you in that expensive school." "I know someone who might be interested," she whispered. Torres squeezed her hand, the gesture encompassing 22 years of love, sacrifice, misunderstanding, and forgiveness. "I was hoping you might." 6 months later, the sign outside Torres Construction read Castillo and Associates in both English and Spanish. Evelyn had insisted on reclaiming her father's name, both professionally and personally. The business had grown beyond anything Torres had imagined. 3 full crews, contracts with the city for public projects, and a reputation for quality work and fair wages that attracted the best craftsmen in Phoenix. Evelyn worked in the field as often as she worked in the office, learning to read the language of concrete and steel, understanding the rhythm of construction that had shaped her childhood. Her hands were developing calluses, and she learned to tie her hair back in a way that wouldn't get caught in power tools. She'd also learned that intelligence and education came in many forms, and that some of the smartest people she'd ever met had never set foot in a college classroom. On a Tuesday evening in February, they sat on the porch reviewing bids for a new school renovation project. The work would take 8 months and employ dozens of local workers. It was the kind of project that would make a real difference in the community. "We should celebrate if we get this one,"
Evelyn said, looking up from the blueprints spread across their makeshift table. How do you want to celebrate? Torres asked. Evelyn grinned, and for a moment she looked exactly like the little girl who used to help him by handing him tools and asking endless questions about how things worked. With a graduation party, she said, the one we never had. Torres raised an eyebrow. You want to celebrate graduating from Harvard? No, she said, her voice soft with emotion. I want to celebrate graduating into the person I was always meant to be, the person you raised me to become before I got lost trying to be someone else. As the desert sun set behind them, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, father and daughter continued working by the light of the porch lamp. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new projects, new opportunities to build something meaningful together. But tonight they were simply Torres and Evelyn Castillo, home at last, laying the foundation for a future neither had imagined, but both had always dreamed of. The mockingbird in the Palo Verde tree sang its evening song, weaving together melodies from a dozen different sources into something entirely new and beautiful, just like the life they were building, one day at a time.